The sound of my leather portfolio hitting the marble floor of the 47th floor boardroom wasn't the worst part. It was the laughter that followed. Not loud, rowdy laughter, no. This was the kind that lives in the back of the throat, restrained, polished, and absolutely merciless. I wish I could tell you I was surprised, but humiliation, I've learned, has a very specific smell. In that room, it smelled like aged scotch, imported leather, and inherited arrogance. My name is Margaret Elaine Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and until that Tuesday morning in the winter of my 4th decade in private banking, I believed I understood what disrespect looked like. I was wrong. To understand what happened, you need to see the room as I saw it. Picture a boardroom perched above Midtown Manhattan, floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over a gray January sky. 40 of the most powerful names in East Coast wealth management seated around an oval table of black granite, the kind of table where fortunes are moved, not earned. I was standing near the head of it, my notes open, my reading glasses low on my nose, preparing to present a client portfolio audit that would finalize the most significant institutional deal Whitmore Vance Capital had seen in 20 years. Then he walked in. Carter Vance III, 32 years old, grandson of the firm's co-founder. The kind of man who wears his inheritance like a cologne. You smell it the moment he enters a room. He strolled in 4 minutes late, still holding his phone, eyes scanning the room until they landed on the chair beside his grandfather's, the chair where I sat, the chair I had occupied at every quarterly board presentation for 11 years. His face hardened. "That's my chair," he said, loud enough, deliberate enough. "Move." I didn't have time to stand. He placed his hand on the back of my chair and pulled it, sharply, decisively, sending me off balance. My portfolio went first, then my reading glasses, then I followed, catching myself on the edge of the table before my knee met the floor. The room went silent, in that particular way rooms go silent when people decide that what they are witnessing is not their problem. No one moved, not the senior partners, not the associates. Not Edmund Vance himself, the 79-year-old patriarch who once told me over a dinner in his Sutton Place townhouse that I was the most precise financial mind this firm had ever employed. Carter slid into the seat, straightened his cufflinks, looked at me the way one looks at a coat rack placed in an inconvenient spot. I stood. I retrieved my portfolio. I walked calmly to the far end of the table, the seat reserved for junior analysts and visiting counsel, and I sat down. My hands were trembling beneath the table, but my face was still. I had spent 4 decades in rooms that did not want me in them. I had learned that composure, when held under pressure, becomes its own form of armor. That evening, while Carter Vance hosted a client dinner at a private club on the East Upper Side, a dinner I later learned he billed to firm expenses, I sat at the desk in my apartment on the 22nd floor of a building on Central Park West with 7 months of documentation spread across 3 monitors. Fee diversions routed through nominee accounts, fabricated performance reports sent to clients, transfers disguised as portfolio optimization fees, pulling funds from elderly clients' accounts, some of them in their 80s, into holding entities that existed only on paper. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't recklessness, it was architecture. Carter Vance III had built a very elegant machine for stealing from the people who trusted this firm with their life's wealth. At 1:48 in the morning, I finished the final summary document. At 1:52, I addressed it to the firm's board of independent directors, to the Securities and Exchange Commission, to the New York State Department of Financial Services, to 3 senior partners whose names did not appear anywhere in the documentation. At 2:58 a.m., I scheduled delivery for 7:15 a.m., 45 minutes before the firm's senior leadership morning call. At 2:01 a.m.,
I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window, and watched the city breathe below me. I did not want revenge. I had long overcome revenge. What I wanted was the truth to be given the room it deserved.
By 7:22 the following morning, Carter's phone had received 9 calls. By 7:40, 23. By 8:10, when I stepped into the lobby of the tower on Park Avenue and nodded to the security desk, his assistant had been trying to reach him for over an hour. When the elevator doors opened on 47, I saw him standing in the hall outside the boardroom. Pale, slightly undone, collar open, no jacket. His phone lit up again in his hand, and he stared at it the way a person stares at something they cannot stop and cannot outrun. He looked up and saw me. 112 missed calls. He looked at me like I was the answer he had been dreading, and I suppose, in every way that mattered, I was. I've always believed there are 2 kinds of silence, the kind that means peace, and the kind that means a storm is already inside the walls. At 8:44 a.m., the firm's general counsel, Patricia Osai, appeared beside my desk with an expression that was apologetic and entirely unsurprised. "Margaret," she said quietly, "the independent board wants you in conference room A." She paused. "Now." I closed my laptop, picked up my portfolio, and followed her down the hall. Through the glass walls of conference room A, I could hear voices before I entered. Not the composed, measured tones of men who believed they controlled outcomes. These were voices under pressure, voices that had been confident an hour ago and were no longer sure of anything. When I walked in, 6 people turned toward me simultaneously. The 3 independent board directors positioned in a tight cluster at the far end of the table, Patricia Osai standing near the wall, the firm's chief compliance officer, a careful, gray-haired man named Harold Stearns, seated with a stack of printed documents in front of him, and Carter. He was seated at the near end of the table. His jacket had been found. His composure had not. His phone sat face down on the table, buzzing at intervals like a trapped insect. The lead independent board director, a woman named Constance Fairweather, 71 years old, former Federal Reserve governor, the kind of woman who had outlasted 4 generations of men who underestimated her, looked at me with an expression that contained, beneath its formality, something close to recognition. "Margaret," she said, "please sit." I sat. "Did you compile and transmit these materials?" She slid a printed copy of my summary document across the table. The room held its breath. "Yes," I said, "I did." Carter made a sound, sharp, compressed, something between contempt and desperation. "This is a fabrication," he said. "She's been systematically trying to undermine me since I joined this firm. She's bitter, she's threatened, and she manipulated confidential data to construct a narrative." "That's enough, Carter." Constance's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. She turned back to me. "These are serious allegations, Margaret. You're describing unauthorized fee diversion, falsified performance documentation, and structured misappropriation from client accounts. I'm describing what the documentation shows. I didn't interpret it. I compiled it." Harold Stearns cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the primary exhibits," he said, addressing the board. "They're internally consistent. The account structures described match our actual system records. If the secondary sources confirm..." He stopped himself, looked at the board. "We have significant regulatory exposure." A muscle moved in Constance Fairweather's jaw. She turned to Carter. "These transfers, did you authorize them?" Carter's throat moved. "The fee structures were within my discretionary authority as..." "That is not what I asked." Constance's eyes were very still. "Did you authorize transfers from client accounts into these holding entities?" A long silence opened up in the room. Carter's phone buzzed again. He turned it over. I caught a glimpse of the screen before it went dark. Edmund Vance Sr. calling. His grandfather. Something crossed Carter's face then.
something that looked for the first time like genuine fear rather than performed confidence. "I want legal counsel before I answer further questions," he said. The room shifted. Constance looked at Patricia Osai. Patricia gave a small nod. Constance turned back to me. "Margaret, we are placing you on voluntary administrative leave on full compensation while we conduct an independent review. I want to be clear, this is procedural, not punitive." I nodded. I had expected nothing less. As I rose to leave, Carter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get to do this," and his voice had lost its polish entirely. "You've been in this firm for 40 years and you've never built anything. You've maintained, you've preserved, you've managed other people's legacies because you don't have one, and now you think you can burn mine down?" I stopped. I looked at him, this 32-year-old man who had never needed to be anything other than his grandfather's surname, and I felt something that surprised me.
Not anger, not satisfaction, sorrow. The particular sorrow of watching someone discover, far too late, that a name is not the same as a character. "I didn't come for your legacy, Carter," I said. "I came for the clients whose retirement accounts you treated as a personal liquidity fund. I came for the 81-year-old widow in Westchester whose portfolio fees doubled without her knowledge. I came for the truth." I paused. "You built what you built. I simply turned on the lights." As I walked toward the door, I heard his voice behind me, quiet now, stripped of its performance. "You're gonna regret this, Margaret." I didn't turn around, because what Carter Vance III did not yet understand was that what I had sent that morning was only the opening of a much larger account. The balance had been accumulating for a long time, and the final reckoning had not yet arrived. Being placed on administrative leave should have felt like a suspension, a forced pause. Instead, it felt like sitting in a concert hall after the orchestra has stopped tuning, that particular silence just before something important begins. The next morning, 3 messages arrived from colleagues before 7 a.m. They've brought in an external forensic accounting team. Someone said the SEC has already been in contact. Edmund Vance Sr. didn't come in today. I made coffee, I read, I watched the river from my window. At 10:30, my phone rang. Patricia Osai. "Margaret," she said, "the independent board has asked whether you'd be willing to meet with them today, voluntarily. It's important." 90 minutes later, I was in a black car crossing Midtown. When I arrived, security met me in the lobby and escorted me directly to the 48th floor, a floor I had never been invited to before, the firm's executive board suite, private, quiet, the kind of room where decisions were made that the rest of the building only learned about afterward. Constance Fairweather sat at the head of a small round table. Beside her, the firm's outside counsel, and beside him, a man I didn't recognize, compact, measured, wearing a badge I recognized as federal. "Thank you for coming," Constance said. "Please sit." She slid a folder toward me. "In the past 18 hours, our forensic team has independently verified the primary account transfers you documented, but they've also found something you didn't include." I opened the folder. It was a second set of books. Not a metaphor, an actual second ledger, a shadow accounting structure maintained in a separate encrypted file, accessible only from Carter's private terminal. In it, 27 additional client accounts, transfers spanning 4 years, total diverted funds, just over $6.4 million. My breath moved slowly. "There's more," the outside counsel said. He turned his laptop toward me. Security footage from the firm's document management center, 11:58 p.m., 3 weeks prior. Carter, in a visitor badge in civilian clothing, accessing the physical records archive on a floor where he had no documented overnight clearance. He removed 3 folders,
He photographed documents for 11 minutes. He left. We believe, Constance said carefully, that he was preparing exit documentation, transferring client information he intended to take with him. She paused. To a competing firm, a boutique operation in the Cayman Islands with which he had been in undisclosed contact for 8 months. The federal agent leaned forward. Ms. Whitmore, what I'm about to tell you explains the scale of what we're looking at. He set a single printed page in front of me. Carter Vance III had accumulated personal debts in excess of $2 million, private leveraged investments, margin calls on personal accounts, 2 failed real estate ventures he kept off the firm's disclosure register. He needed liquidity. He used client accounts to generate it. And when that wasn't going to be sufficient, he arranged to sell proprietary client data in portfolio strategies to a foreign competitor. I looked at the page. Then I looked up. And Edmund Vance, I asked, the senior founding partner, does he know the extent of it? The federal agent and Constance exchanged a glance. That, Constance said, is part of what we're still determining. A knock on the door. An associate entered and handed Constance a single sheet. She read it. Her expression, already composed, became more careful still.
Margaret, she said slowly, there is one additional item we need to discuss. She turned the page toward me. It was a log. Internal system access records. My name appeared 17 times. Access timestamps, document views, search queries, none of which I had performed. Someone had been using my credentials. He was building a record, the outside counsel said, creating a digital trail suggesting the irregularities had been accessed and potentially manipulated from your profile. I sat, very still. He was going to blame you, I said. Yes, Constance said. You were the most credible possible candidate. Long tenure, access to records, no family connections to protect. From his perspective, a clean target. I thought about the 40 years, the quarterly presentations, the chair I had always sat in, the clients whose accounts I had guarded with more care than they sometimes guarded themselves. The idea that all of it could have been buried under my name. What happens now? I asked. Carter's access has been suspended and his personal accounts frozen, the federal agent said. We have a warrant. We're moving to formal charges. Wire fraud, securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and attempted data misappropriation. And this morning, Constance added, Edmund Vance requested a private meeting with independent counsel. He's preparing a statement. As I stood to leave, the federal agent said, Miss Whitmore, I want you to know your documentation was meticulous, the kind of record that makes a case rather than complicates one. Whatever happens next, you gave us something solid to stand on. I thanked him. I walked to the elevator. In the lobby, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. A single line of text. You have no idea what you've set in motion, old woman. This isn't finished. I read it once. I saved it and forwarded it to Patricia Osai with a 3-word note. Evidence. Please file. Then I put my phone in my bag and walked out onto Park Avenue into the cold January air. The city moved around me. Taxis, pedestrians, the low percussion of a city that does not pause for anyone's crisis. I stood on the pavement for a long moment and breathed. I was 68 years old. I had spent 40 decades in rooms that didn't always want me in them. I had been patient in the way that people who have no other choice learn to be patient. And somewhere above me, on the 47th floor of a glass tower, the architecture of one man's lies was finally beginning to come apart at every seam. The next 48 hours moved the way all genuine reckonings move, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet, irreversible steps. On the second morning after my meeting with the board, Patricia Osai called to tell me that Carter had left his apartment on the Upper West Side the previous evening with a single carry-on bag. His car had been found in a parking structure near Penn Station.
His phone had gone dark at 9:43 p.m. He was running. I had not been surprised by what he'd done in the boardroom. I was not surprised by this either. Men who have only ever operated from positions of assumed safety tend to panic when the ground shifts beneath them. They mistake movement for strategy. That afternoon, I was contacted by a special agent from the Securities Fraud Division, a composed woman named Agent Delgado. She asked me to come in. In a clean, fluorescent interview room in the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan, she walked me through what they had gathered. Carter had made 3 cash withdrawals totaling $34,000 in the 36 hours before disappearing. He had booked a one-way flight to Zurich under a variation of his middle name. He had contacted his Cayman Islands counterpart twice in the past 24 hours from a burner number. He also attempted to access your accounts, Agent Delgado said. She placed a printed log before me. Your personal email, your financial records, your cloud backup from the firm. She paused. He was looking for anything he could use to counter your documentation or to discredit you if it came to a public hearing. I looked at the log.
He failed, she said, and he left a very clear trail in the process. She looked at me steadily. We located him this morning. He was at JFK, at the International Terminal. He was taken into custody at 6:17 a.m. I didn't speak for a moment. "It's over?" I asked. "This part," she said. "Yes." On a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks later, the firm's entire staff gathered in the main atrium of the tower. Analysts, partners, administrative staff, operations, standing in the open space between the elevators and the trading floor entrance. Word had come through internal communications that Edmund Vance Sr. would address the firm directly. He came in through the side entrance, not the executive corridor. He was 79 years old, and he moved carefully, with a cane he had not carried the last time I had seen him. He stood before the assembled room, and the noise dissolved into something very quiet. "This firm was built on a principle," he said, "that the trust placed in us by our clients is the only currency that cannot be recovered if lost." He paused. "That principle was violated by my grandson, and, in part, by my own failure to look clearly at what I was being shown." He looked out at the room. "Carter has been formally charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. He will face those charges without the support of this firm. Effective immediately, I am resigning as senior founding partner and transferring operational governance to the independent board." He straightened slightly. "I should have done more to guard what this firm was entrusted to protect. I did not. That will remain with me." No one applauded. The room held the silence the way a room holds a thing it knows is important. After Edmund stepped back, Constance Fairweather took his place. "We are implementing a complete structural review of our compliance and oversight architecture," she said. "We are establishing an independent client advocacy office. We are making restitution to every affected client account, in full, with interest." She paused. "And we would like to acknowledge the person whose integrity, persistence, and precision made it possible for this firm to face what it needed to face." My name was called. I did not want to stand. I am not, by nature, a person who requires recognition, but I stood. Because the moment was not about me, it was about the 81-year-old widow in Westchester, about the retired surgeon in Connecticut whose account had been quietly drained over 3 years, about every client who had handed their life's financial security to people who were supposed to be worthy of it. The room applauded, long and genuine. 3 months later, the firm was restructured, the compliance office rebuilt from its foundations, and the forensic audit concluded. Carter Vance III entered a plea agreement, 7 years in federal prison, full restitution, permanent bar from the securities industry. Edmund Vance Sr. retired to his home in Newport, Rhode Island, and was not heard from publicly again. I was offered the position of Chief Integrity Officer, a newly created role with a seat on the independent board. I thought about it for a long time. Then I declined, not from bitterness, not from exhaustion,
but because I had discovered somewhere in the long months of gathering evidence in the quiet of my apartment above Central Park that the work I cared most about was not the work of institutions, it was the work of people. Individual people, often elderly, often alone, who had been made to feel that their financial futures were too complicated for them to understand and too important to question.
I accepted a position, instead, with a non-profit organization on the West Side, an advocacy group that provided free financial oversight services to senior citizens who believed, rightly, that they were being taken advantage of. We reviewed accounts, we filed complaints, we helped people reclaim what had been taken from them, quietly, over years, by people they had trusted. On my last day at the firm, Harold Stearns, the chief compliance officer who had been the first to say, in that tense boardroom meeting, that my documents were credible, stopped by the office I was clearing. "You saved this firm, Margaret," he said, "more than it probably deserves." I looked at him carefully. "I didn't save it. I held up a mirror. What it does with the reflection, that was never up to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It should have been you, 40 years ago, running this place." "Perhaps," I said, "but then I wouldn't have had 40 years to learn what it actually needed." I walked out of the building at 4:30 on a January afternoon, 1 year almost to the day from the morning Carter Vance III had pulled my chair. The air was cold and clear and smelled like the city, exhaust and winter and the faint metallic bite of something that never quite sleeps. I didn't think about the fall. I didn't think about the boardroom or the laughter or the long nights at my desk with the monitors bright and the city dark below. I thought about a 68-year-old woman who had spent 4 decades doing the quiet, meticulous, invisible work of protecting other people's futures, who had been pushed to the floor in a room full of people who did not move to help her, and who had stood up anyway. That is the thing about truth. It does not require an audience. It does not need the room's permission. When the time comes and it has been carefully, patiently prepared, it simply opens, the way a door opens when a key finally turns. And once that light is in a room, there is no putting it back. Justice is not what happens to other people for what they did to you. Justice is the restoration of what was true before the damage was done. I had spent a long time learning the difference. Now, finally, I was free to live it.